Nonprofits can advocate without fear. Did he just say that?
Surely
I can't believe he said
we will lose a
that. I can't believe
501c3
he said that.
status.
Advocacy is a scary topic for nonprofits. Some leaders would literally not even say the word advocate out of fear of losing their 501c3 status. But today, I'm hoping to ease some of those fears associated with nonprofit advocacy through this conversation with Leah McDermott, Program Director of Florida Nonprofit Alliance. Leah has been involved in the nonprofit sector for more than 20 years. She conducts and facilitates trainings on various topics, including board's roles and responsibilities, board governance and engagement, and the topic we will be discussing today, advocacy. Let's make advocacy more approachable and less scary on this episode of the Nonprofit Thrivability Podcast by Beyond the Blog. Hello everyone, it is your host, Reed Corley, consultant for the Patterson Foundation, jumping in from the future with a quick update. Since recording this interview, we are excited to share that 2 Nonprofit Advocacy 101 workshops presented by the Florida Nonprofit Alliance are coming to our community. Both sessions will take place on June 25th, 2025, and they'll cover the same content, so you can choose which one that fits your schedule best. The morning session is from 9 to 11 a.m. at State College of Florida, and the afternoon session runs from 2 to 4 p.m. at Plantation Golf and Country Club. For more details or to register, click the link in the episode description, or you can email advocacy101workshop@gmail.com for more information. If you enjoy what you hear in this episode and would like to learn more, please join us for one of these 2 sessions. Now, back to the podcast. Leah, advocacy, it feels like a dangerous word in the nonprofit community. Why do you think that is?
I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding about what advocacy really is, and a lot of myths out there about what is legal and ethical for nonprofits to engage in. And so part of our message as Florida Nonprofit Alliance is to make sure people know it is legal, it is ethical, and it's a great way for them to be able to tackle their mission in a different way. Because a lot of these organizations, a lot of nonprofit organizations across the state are wrestling with really old, really complicated problems that they're trying to solve. And at some point, our great programs and services that we provide really are only acting as a Band-Aid to try to get people from one day to the other. And by focusing on advocacy and public policy work, we're able to get to the root of the problem, to make some changes to the existing policy that is there, introduce new policy that can help us change and really tackle our missions in a new and more effective way to support the communities that we work in.
How do you and Florida Nonprofit Alliance then define advocacy, and then how might that be different than what people traditionally think of as advocacy? You just said there a couple times, policy.
Yeah.
You mentioned that. So how do you guys define advocacy?
Absolutely. Advocacy is a very broad term, right? Anytime we try to influence how someone feels about something, that's advocacy. So in a lot of ways, even when we do things like fundraising or recruiting for our programs or finding new board members, we're advocating on behalf of our organization in the broad term. Right? We're talking about what we do, why it matters, and how they can get involved. And that is the nice thing about advocacy work, is that we probably all are doing it in some level in our day-to-day work. And by just being a little bit more strategic and talking about what the benefits might be, we might be able to expand that work to influence other decision makers in the community, to really make sure everyone understands the value, the importance, and the impact that our organizations have.
So now let's back up a little bit here. Can you talk a little bit about, Florida Nonprofit Alliance, what the purpose of the Alliance is, and yourself, how you came to work with Florida Nonprofit Alliance?
Yes, absolutely. So we are the State Association for Nonprofits in Florida. We were actually founded by a group of organizations from across the state that were doing what we call capacity building work. So, helping nonprofits with how to run the day-to-day operations, thinking through strategy, gathering people and networking with each other on a regional basis. But one of the things that all of those groups were missing was the opportunity to do large-scale advocacy work. So they came together and said, we think we need this state alliance to help communicate what's going on with elected officials and decision makers in the community, but to also rally nonprofits around advocacy issues that directly affect the work that we are trying to do. So that is, I think, a really nice testament to how we came to be and the support that we have across the state. And we spend most of our time now in the advocacy advocacy and public policy space. So we do direct lobbying for nonprofits in Washington, D.C. and Tallahassee, but we also spend a lot of our time helping nonprofits understand how they can do that work for themselves. What makes sense for them? How do we create a plan? How do we get everybody on board? And how do we make sure we're doing this in a legal and ethical manner that's going to be effective for the work that we want to do? We also have a pretty robust body of statewide research that not only helps us educate the general public about the nonprofit sector, but we think it's also a really useful tool to nonprofits because it helps you strengthen your messaging. So when you're looking for data points or research back up to why things matter, why we're choosing to do things this way, we're able to provide this Florida-specific research to help them strengthen their messaging.
And so you had mentioned just there that you guys will lobby on behalf of organizations. You'll go to DC. And I think that a lot of people consider lobbying as a piece of advocacy. Can nonprofits lobby? And, how do you guys take on that responsibility under the Alliance and go to DC and do that?
Absolutely. So yes, nonprofit organizations, if they are 501c3 public charities, they are legally allowed to lobby. That right is given to us through laws passed by Congress, the 1976 Congress lobby laws, and also from regulations from the IRS. So they're the regulating body for nonprofits at the federal level. They do give permission to nonprofits to lobby with some limits around it, right? And it mostly is about how much lobbying can do. We want to make sure that it's not a substantial part of our charitable activities, but as long as you are underneath the limits that are set by the IRS, it is perfectly legal, perfectly ethical. We do always want to make sure as a nonprofit sector that we are nonpartisan, that we are talking about the issues that affect our particular nonprofit organization, and that, of course, we're always doing it in a way that is respectful, that's building community, building bridges. I think one of the really nice things about advocacy and lobbying work for nonprofit organizations is that we can actually become an expert resource for these elected officials. They're only human beings, right? They can't possibly know everything they need to know about every piece of legislation that's coming in front of them. So if something does come up that's related to the arts, related to housing, that's related to workforce development, child development, we have that expertise. And if they know that we are out there and that we are committed to improving community in this nonpartisan way, we can really help them learn more about the issues before they have to make those decisions when they sit in their legislative body.
So let's say that, some organizations might be afraid of actually lobbying for that fear of losing that 501c3 status. What are some forms of advocacy that they can partake in that don't reach that level of lobbying, that very dangerous word, scary word?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not dangerous, a little bit scary, a little bit intimidating if you haven't done it before. But yes, if you're like, lobbying's not for us at this time, we're not ready to jump into that part of advocacy, there's so many great ways that you can get involved. I personally think one of the best ways to do that is low cost and low risk, is to get involved in coalitions. So finding coalitions that are either geographically based, maybe in your region or in the state of Florida. It might be mission based. So, thinking about all of organizations of similar work coming together to make some changes. The nice part about coalition is that, like I said, there's not usually a lot of financial commitment that you need to bring to it. And you're also helping to develop your personal advocacy skills by learning from your peers that are also in this network. Sometimes you do have to compromise a little bit on what your ultimate goals are going to be at the time to find that consensus for the group. But I think that downside is usually outweighed by the positives and the strengths that come from working together. Plus, people from outside the sector love to see examples of how we're collaborating. And I think coalitions are a really great way to be able to demonstrate the power of the collective work of the sector. Doing research is another way that you can do advocacy that helps educate. Nonprofits can also engage in nonpartisan voter education and engagement. So if you are interested in doing things like making sure people understand when elections are happening or how they can register to vote, or learning, a little bit more about the candidates that are on their ballot. Once again, we remain nonpartisan. We don't endorse any particular candidate or political party, but they do have the opportunity to make sure that people who are registered voters or who have are eligible to be registered voters have the chance to get their voice heard. And that just means that the people who are elected understand all of their constituents, not just the people that have traditionally done that work.
Absolutely. And it seems like with many of the problems that our nonprofits are trying to tackle are way bigger than just what one organization can actually physically do. So the ability to join coalitions and work together, I think, is super powerful to really expand that message beyond just the communities that you're in. Maybe coming back to the high level here, why is it important for nonprofits to advocate just in general?
Well, I think it helps. I would say, first of all, it's a good exercise in making sure we're really clear about what our impact is and how it affects the community as a whole, right? When we have to kind of sit down and think about how would we explain this to other people, it's a very good exercise in making sure that what we do actually is a benefit to the community. It helps us sort of align. And then I think the other piece of really investing and thinking about advocacy is this idea of how do we make sure that we have all the resources and all the knowledge to truly be able to meet our mission. Are there opportunities that are out there? Are there things that need to change? Is there awareness that needs to be raised about particular parts of what we're doing? And advocacy is all about that, right? We're just trying to influence people's opinion about what we do and communicate our messages effectively. And that has very broad reach beyond just elected officials, beyond just decision makers in the community, but to our own constituents, to potential donors, volunteers, board members, even our own staff members, right? This can be very inspiring for them to understand how you fit into the bigger picture and how we're trying to really affect the work that we're doing.
So how can nonprofits find out more information about advocacy, and maybe what are some of the resources that Florida Nonprofit Alliance provides in terms of advocacy?
We have a ton of resources on our website, which is flnonprofits.org. So you can start there. There's definitions of advocacy and lobbying, a description of what we are and are not allowed to do. We also provide workshops and trainings on a regular basis. So they're virtual. You can participate. Most of them are about 90 minutes long. And that will give you a really good introduction to everything from Advocacy 101 to how to create a policy agenda for your organization, how to measure your effectiveness if you are doing advocacy work. And lots of other topics in between. We also have a monthly newsletter that goes out that's available to anybody to sign up for. It's free. We really try to just send once a month, so we're not spamming you with a lot of extra information, but that will give you a really good idea of the type of information that we are tracking, what we do and how we communicate that to the nonprofit sector. I will say, for Florida Nonprofit Alliance, when we look at issues that we are specifically taking a position on, they do tend to be issues that affect the entire sector overall. So we're not so much involved in the subsector or mission specific legislation that might come up. We will communicate that to you and let you know about it. But when FNA gets involved in something, it's something that might threaten the existence or health of the sector overall. So a more narrow scope for what we directly take positions on. And then we're also available, as staff to help with any questions that you have. Reach out. We are a membership organization. We have about 400 members across the state, all different missions, all different sizes, all different geographic locations, and of course would welcome anyone to join our network to learn from each other, to have some conversations about what you see happening, and then to get some additional resources as well.
I'm glad that you mentioned, you guys advocate in a very narrow way, like Florida Nonprofit Alliance does. What are some examples of some things that you guys specifically advocate on? Is it like affordable housing, legislation related to nonprofits? Could you provide some examples of that?
Yeah, I sure can. So we wouldn't typically get involved in something like affordable housing or funding for arts and cultures organization. That was a big question after last legislative session. So the issues that we're looking at is there something that's going to harm or burden all nonprofit organizations? A couple of years ago, we had an example, actually from Sarasota, of a local property appraiser who was trying to figure out how to assess additional property taxes on nonprofit organizations in a way that didn't seem to really fit with the spirit of the law. And so we were made aware of that by some of your great colleagues in the area. And we were worried that might spread, that other local municipalities might look at that and say, oh, that's a great idea for us to increase our revenue in some way. So we worked with the legislator, with Joe Gruters, to help create some state legislation that would limit the local property appraisers ability to levy those additional taxes on nonprofits. So that's one example of something that was going to affect everyone that we really wanted to focus in on. We also have had some really great partners in the legislature over the years where they may have an idea that they are very committed to, but their initial, creation of the legislation kind of leaves some holes or some gray areas that we think might leave some questions or some space for a nonprofit for it not to really do what it's intended to do. So we are able to work with them in the amendment process to suggest, hey, how about we do this instead? So 2 years ago, when the transparency bill passed, we felt like it wasn't overly burdensome on nonprofits on what kind of information they had to share. We were able to educate the lawmakers on what already existed out there that they had access to. So we do a lot of that, working with our partners, working kind of behind the scenes to make sure the legislation is not going to be overly burdensome or harmful to nonprofit organizations.
Absolutely. And I believe the first organization we're talking about was Selby Gardens. And if it is appropriate, I will add a little bit of information in the podcast description for the listeners to go check out, how Florida Nonprofit Alliance helped Selby Gardens with, it was the restaurant, I believe.
That's right.
So I'll add a little link in there, assuming that is appropriate to add. So the listeners can go check that out.
Great.
So Leah, when you guys are facilitating these meetings, you said it's about 90 minutes. What are some of the main takeaways that people will get from these facilitated sessions? And then also, what are some of your most common questions that people ask during these sessions?
Yeah, absolutely. So our most popular workshop that we have is Advocacy 101. It's a very good starting point, especially if you're kind of newer to thinking about advocacy. Or you may be the executive director of an organization that's comfortable with it, but you have board members or staff members with some questions or reservations about it. So that's a great entry into that. We go through the legalities of advocacy and lobbying in very specific detail, what you can and can't do, how you can track and make sure that you're staying within your limits. What are some pieces that you internally can create to help make sure your advocacy work is successful? And then how do you actually do the advocacy work with the audiences that you're working with? So it kind of walks through all those different sections. I would say one of the most common questions that we hear is, how do I get my board on board with advocacy? A lot of times, the boards are responsible for making sure the organization is doing what it's supposed to do. And sometimes they get a little bit nervous, like they might believe that we're not allowed to lobby. They might believe we're not allowed to do advocacy work, which is not correct, so that they need some education on yes, that is the case and where they can learn more about that. Sometimes they understand that we can do it, but they're still reluctant. They just feel like it's too much of a risk. So we do talk about, what are the ways to make sure that your board has the opportunity to really think through, what are we trying to accomplish with our community and our mission? And are there any ways that advocacy could help fill in some gaps that we're not currently able to reach through our programs and services? Would there be any benefit to us talking to a wider audience in a different way about the issue that we're trying to solve, right? The issue we're trying to resolve in the community to make that go away? And allowing them to have that discussion, to maybe, walk through the process of coming to the understanding of how advocacy might help is really powerful. The other thing that I think is really helpful for boards is to go through the process of creating a policy agenda or a legislative agenda of some kind. So in this process, you talk about, what do we do? What do we not do? What kinds of issues will we get involved with? Who decides if something comes up that we haven't discussed in the past? And so it really builds some trust and confidence for people who are maybe a little bit skeptical in the process. They understand it's not just, willy-nilly, we jump in, we don't jump in. There's a process for understanding. It always relates back to our mission. And there's a process for making that decision that people aren't going to be left out of. So you're not really losing that control. So I think that's a really powerful tool for an organization that's starting to do a little bit more advocacy work to go through that process, give some confidence to the leaders of the organization.
Definitely. Thank you for addressing the board member question, because that was actually my next question. So that's awesome. But I think something important you said in there was, what we're not going to advocate for. And I feel like it's almost as important to know that as well as, what you will advocate for. And so organizations don't have to advocate on behalf of everything, right?
They don't. In fact, they shouldn't, right? I mean, we all have limited resources. No one's sitting around like, wow, I wish I had more things on my to-do list, right? So it's very important from an internal capacity standpoint to make sure we're clear on what we're doing and not doing. It's also important to doing advocacy work in a legal way to make sure that are all things that relate back to our mission. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a gray area, right? We've been talking a little bit about affordable housing. So let's use the example of maybe a homeless shelter, right? Obviously, advocating for more funding for affordable housing or workforce housing probably makes sense. That would be like an easy connection there. But what if an issue comes up that's more money for addiction recovery or more money for universal pre-K, right? They may know that their clients could benefit from both of those programs, from an investment in both of those programs, but they have to take a look at what's happening within their organization, what's happening in the environment around, and decide, is this the right issue for us to commit to at this moment in time? Or is it time for us to step back and let someone else take that charge? And so it is, a kind of an ongoing conversation. You don't just set it and forget it. You have to kind of follow up on a regular basis. Is this the best thing for our organization, for our mission, our community? And is it the right time? And so finding that sweet spot of where that intersects, it's okay to say we have to sit this one out because we also, want to make sure that we don't lose that political influence that we have by speaking with expertise about the communities that we serve if it's something that's not truly a good fit for what we're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. It sounds a lot like mission creep, and it sounds a lot like you really need to be aligned as a team, as an organization on what it is you are going to advocate on behalf of. So winding this interview down here, last catch-all question here. Is there anything else that you think we have not talked about yet that nonprofits should be aware of when it comes to advocacy?
I guess my kind of closing comments for this would be that there's a lot going on around us right now, right? There's a lot of actions happening at the federal and state level. And so I think it makes advocacy even more important, but also doing advocacy in a way that is strategic, that you feel confident is going to benefit the work that you're doing in the community. So taking our time, taking a breath, having internal conversations about what we're going to do, making sure we're not making ourselves a target or drawing unnecessary attention to ourselves, but still feeling like we can speak up for the communities that we work with and for the causes that we represent. And so it is going to take, I think, a little bit more planning and a little bit more strategy to make sure we do that in a way that's most beneficial for our organizations. But we also can't just hide away, right? We have to make sure that if there is something that's really going to affect the work that we do, it's going to affect the impact that we can have, then maybe it's the right time to speak up.
Absolutely. Well, Leah McDermott, thank you so much for joining me on the Beyond the Blog podcast. Thanks for demystifying this term of advocacy and making it a little less scary, hopefully, so people can continue to make a difference in their community.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Nonprofit Thrivability Podcast by Beyond the Blog. For more information, please visit thepattersonfoundation.org/beyondtheblog.